Hi, my name is Chanda Rule. I'm a singer, storyteller, joy spreader, and host of the Courageous Voice podcast. The Courageous Voice podcast gathers and shares stories from artistic folks around the world and their journeys through fear, courageousness, and creativity. Join us and get inspired with me as we chat about learning to befriend and walk with and past our fears to share our voices courageously with the world. Okay, welcome back to the latest episode of The Courageous Voice. I hope y'all have been enjoying all this fabulous content. I am super excited today because my dad is joining us. I'm so excited. So listen, my dad's name is Ed Rule. And this is the day after Father's Day. So listen, even if it wasn't, I'd be like, he's the greatest dad in the world. So welcome, Daddy, Mr. Rule, Ed Rule. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Chanda.
Thank you for agreeing to come on my podcast.
Yes. You twisted my arm.
I didn't. I live in Vienna, so I didn't twist your arm. So listen, let me just say a few words about Mr. Rule, and then he will introduce himself in the Courageous Voice podcast forum. I don't know if that's the right word. Mr. Rule is a father. He is a husband. He is a brother. He is a deacon. Wait, once a deacon, always a deacon, right? I don't say former deacon. He's a deacon. He is a community activist. He's retired now, but he's a former business owner. He is a vet. He is a friend. He's a writer, a poet, a speaker. So many different things, an elder now, so many wonderful things. And before I ask him to say a few words about who he's bringing to the podcast today, I asked my dad to join us today to talk about courageous parenting. So specifically the courageous voice and having to do with courageous parenting, but I'm sure we'll talk about many other things. So Daddy, who are you bringing to the Courageous Voice podcast today?
It is I, your dear dad, in person.
It is
I don't know if that requires me to do any additional credentials.
You don't have to say credentials, but you don't have to be so deep. It is I.
Okay. It is I.
Yes. So listen, it is I. Tell me, just for us to get started, everyone has a different definition of what it means to be courageous. And I'm just wondering what it is for you.
I did give it a little thought. For me, courage is the capacity to act in the face of fear. And of course, fear takes many shapes and forms. Fear of life, death, fear of being ostracized, fear of losing one's job, this fear of being rejected, whatever.
And the ability to keep going despite these
fears. In
spite
of, yes.
Yeah. So this is interesting because I feel like you named the fears that you named based on what I know of you are different things that I imagine may have come up with many of these different life transitions that you've had. So you talked about fear of death, which I'm thinking you were in the Vietnam War. So I'm sure some of that, you had a lot of fear of that, fear of losing your job. Oh my gosh, we could get into so many things, how you used your voice back in the 80s to really bring up the conversation of racism in the workplace at a time when nobody was doing that. Fear of being ostracized, I'm sure that had a lot to do with that. You've made a lot of different courageous decisions, even in how you ran your business. So tell us one of your favorite stories about how you use your voice courageously. There's so many. There's so many.
Perhaps one that sticks out most for me was in the military and turning into manhood around the age, I think I must have been around 19, maybe 20 years old. And I did, as you've already mentioned, did get assigned to Vietnam. And when I went to the unit that I was assigned to, I was supposed to be a company clerk. My primary military occupational specialty, which was long form for my job. My primary job was a finance specialist, and my secondary was a personnel specialist. And so when I got to this company, I was supposed to be assigned to that role. But when I got there, the company commander basically told me that there must be a mistake because they already had a company clerk and that I needed to grab my M16 and head to the field.
Oh, wow.
And of course, I protested and asked to be reassigned, but Mr. Company Commander said that his word was final. So basically, long story being made short, I did end up going on several what we call long range ambush patrols.
Without being trained, right?
With no training,
Oh my
precisely.
God.
Okay, M16 and being put out there in the middle of nowhere, 30 miles from base camp. And that didn't sit too well for me. So, again, making this story a little shorter, I ended up learning how to write it to express myself because I knew that I couldn't do it right there in the company because the company commander was supreme. He had all the authority and the power. So I started writing. And believe me, I wrote everybody. I wrote the Secretary of Defense. I wrote General Westmoreland, who was in charge of the military and the Asian theater of the military. I wrote my Congress people. I wrote my mayor. And I don't know who responded, but they got me out of that field. It took me about 2 months, but they got me reassigned to another company. And where I was a company clerk, which is what I was supposed to be in the first place. But they even went above and beyond that because I was only there 3 weeks and they reassigned me to the Adjutant General's Corps. It was a humongous finance office and we were taking care of all the payroll for really all the units within that area, the military units, and we would take care of their pay. And sometimes it meant even actually going out to the field location and taking information from them if they needed to change beneficiaries or create an allotment for parents or wives or whatever. But that worked out well, and I did move up the ranks to supervisor from that point on. That was my first major experience. I guess my second would have been, I think, at Continental Bank, which is no longer in existence.
You did that. You did that. I'm
What's
kidding.
that?
I said you did
No,
that.
no, I didn't do that.
No.
I guess maybe that was just fate or destiny that would occur. But as you mentioned, racism did rear its ugly head. And I'm one who really does not like making excuses. I don't like to what they call play the race card. You're not treating me fairly, etc. But they passed over me a number of times for a promotion because I had actually gone through an loan officer training program. And generally speaking, once you came out of that program, you were promoted to officer within a year and a half, maybe 2 years. I had not received a promotion in about almost 3 years. And I kept noticing that there were people coming in after I had been assigned and they were being promoted. And so I finally started asking questions. And of course, I was always told that it had to do something with my performance or whatever.
But you were training these people, right?
Yes. Training the people. And what really got me is when I'm looking around, people reading the Wall Street Journal and Business Week, etc. And I am just working my behind off. And finally, I just challenged them all and said, if I'm supposed to be underperforming or not up to par, then why do I have the largest accounts in the division? Why are my accounts, excuse me, the most profitable accounts in the division? They could not answer that. Okay. And so finally, I just gave them an ultimatum that they had to do something here, give me some justice or whatever I was going to find it outside the bank. And I ended up having to go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and to file a charge against the bank at that time. And it took several years. It took quite a bit of courage for us to be able to do it. It wasn't something that I just up and did right on the spot. Sometimes courage doesn't work that way. You kind of got to build it up, etc. And I should say, I cannot leave God out of this equation because it was God who was there that was supporting me and urging me to move to defend myself. And not only myself, but this was happening to people of color throughout the institution at that time.
Mm-hmm. When was this? Was early 80s,
This would have
mid?
been, yeah, it might have been late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
Someplace in there. And I did finally get a response back from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It took about 2 years
Wow. Wow.
for them to finally complete it. I had filed 13 charges. And
13?
13 years.
I didn't know this.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And the came back with 9 of them being, I think the terminology they use, justifiable cause, which means that the bank was on the hot seat at that point. And all of a sudden, mysteriously, I got a promotion.
Uh-huh.
And people asking for forgiveness and would I kindly remove my charges?
Uh-huh.
And I said, yes, I will remove my charges. But this guy that sits behind me came in after me, and he's now second vice president. I think I should be a second vice president too. Because I was doing just as much work and probably just as qualified or more qualified. And they refused to do that. And so I left my charges in. When I did get my promotion and my increase, was what the bank did was they went through every minority's records.
Okay.
And there were many, and there are many people at that bank of color who do not know to this day that they got a promotion or increases in salary because of what I had done. Because it was not, I put the charges in not only for just me, but for everybody, because I was noticing that there was a pattern. Anyway, enough of that.
So
those are two major expenses.
But I have a question about that, especially when you're talking about that this process took so long. And I'm trying to remember early 80s with you. And I remember what really stands out in my mind is Mississippi Mass Choir, Keith Prinkle. And this sermon, but I cannot remember this preacher's name, but
it was Dr. Gardner C. Taylor.
Was it these all died in faith, not having received the promise?
That was the one.
So I'm imagining that like these things were keeping you or buoying you, keeping you up at this time. But what else did you use? What were some other tools that you used to keep your courage up for such a long time? And 2 years is a long time to do something like this at that time in the 80s. I'm imagining that people were not speaking out because people were happy to have jobs.
And they really were. And especially people of my race who really did not want to associate with me or to be seen associated with me, because obviously they knew what I had done and they did not want anything to discolor their career by being seen with me. And of course, management was not making it anything palatable for me to work every day. But truly, I think that it was nothing but God that kept me going. You mentioned that sermon, and I remember that was around that time, that was Dr. Gardner C. Taylor. I think he was known as the Dean of Black Preachers, or that he had come to our church and preached this sermon called Failure, Success, in God. And it still almost brings tears to my eyes now to remember that. And I used to listen to it because I remember you asked me, was I trying to memorize the sermon?
You did listen to it. Even I know these all died in faith, not having received the promise.
Yeah.
I remember that. Faithless city, helpless city. God has prepared a city. Sorry, I remember.
Yes, he did. But the crux of that sermon was that. And the crux, because I was beginning to take certain things personally, because when people start telling you, people that you respect and honor, your supervisors and management, et cetera, that you're really not performing up to par, et cetera, you take those things to heart and you think that they're really true. And you start asking yourself, what's wrong with me?
Okay.
And that sermon that he preached, and then I listened to so many times, was basically telling me that you have not failed until you have stopped trying. No matter what the situation or the circumstance that you're in, keep on trying, keep on moving, keep on believing, keep on trusting. And my trust was truly in God, because this was also a time of life where it was really a conversion experience for me too as well. Because despite the fact that I was raised in the church, and despite the fact that my daddy was a minister, I really did not have any strong spiritual connections with God. but God knows how to do things.
Hmm.
He brought me to my knees because up
Okay.
until then, I really truly believed that anything in life that I wanted, if I had the personal will, desire, and aspiration to succeed, and if I really put forth that effort, that I would get there. But I learned that, hey, it ain't you by yourself. It
Hmm.
has to be God. And speaking of courage, and you mentioned it, alluded to it, because it can wane or dissipate. I remember on Sunday evenings, my stomach beginning to just tie up in knots because thinking about, I got to go to work tomorrow. Okay.
Okay.
But it took God. God took me through.
Hmm.
That was a great experience because it was a learning experience. And I think courage is built on things like that because you recognize and remember what God brought you through and that He did not leave you.
No, but this is giving me like just a more dynamic view of courage also because we can't leave out that sacred side.
Mm-mm.
There's so many different sides of it, but so thank you
Mm-hmm.
for adding that. Okay,
Yeah.
I want to back up to the military experience
Yeah.
because
And also the
you
other thing too, I want to mention on that very quickly
yeah,
is
yeah.
that it brought me closer to my own family. In what ways? Because when the rest of the world rejects you, it helps you that you really turn inward more or less
Mm,
to yourself. And then your family is all you got.
okay.
Your wife, your child, and doing things together, etc. So there
Hmm.
are advantages while this courage is growing. Sorry, I
Okay.
interrupted you.
Okay. What I was going to ask you is, but maybe we should go in that direction. Okay, okay. What I was going to ask you was you mentioned that when you were in the military, and I'm imagining you were what, like 18, 19 when you were writing these letters?
Yeah, I would have been about 19, I think, maybe 20,
Maybe,
because it was right
okay,
before, it was a year before I was due to be released from that.
around 20.
Because
So,
up until that time, I had really had good experiences with the military. And
okay.
despite the fact that maybe racism and all that, and what, by the way, it turned out what it brought to my attention just what, 50 years after the fact. I'm talking to one of my counselors at the Veterans Administration, and he basically told me after I requested my military records, they don't show anywhere on there on my military records where I was assigned to the field. Okay, where I was out on
Wow.
loan. And this counselor told me that what happened was that one of the company commander's favorites had my job. That person was supposed to be out there.
Okay.
Okay. But it put me out there instead.
Wow.
Sorry.
No, wow. Now, I was just wondering if you had already been using your writing voice up to that point, or was this like one of the first times and you really started to, you got the power of the pen, so to speak?
Yes. No,
Okay.
to be perfectly honest with you, that was my first time ever doing that. I guess I had really had reservations about writing up until that point. I had a couple of English courses, but I really wasn't enthralled with English. I was more math and science person. Okay. And I believe that all this other stuff just took second. You write your little essays in school, etc., but really hadn't really gotten into it until I had to do
Really?
all these letters. Yeah. So sometimes these experiences come by for a reason in terms of
Okay.
growth as human beings, our growth, and even our relationship with God and ourselves and others.
Okay. That's interesting. So do you still write poetry? Because I remember at one time you were always like scribbling poems on napkins, and I remember you channeling the poetry into things at church. But
Yeah,
I
those were
don't.
more church related things.
Okay.
And I
Okay.
kind of stopped. And as a matter of fact, they're probably still around here because somebody asked me to publish them, but I didn't think that they were worthy of being published.
Oh, come on.
Yeah,
What?
so no, they're still here. I do enjoy sometimes while doing a meditation, which I try to do every morning if I can. Sometimes I'll actually pull out my pen and try to record the thoughts that are going through my mind at that particular time. And I'm
Hmm.
surprised at what sometimes comes out because it didn't start out that way. And so I know writing and journalizing and all the other good stuff, it works.
It works for what?
It works for you getting, I think, inside of yourself even more and learning more about yourself as a human.
Okay.
And again, about that relationship with God and being able to see things from God's perspective. Not that I am God. I will never be God. I will never know what God knows. But at least if nothing else, channeling my direction toward how he sees things, his worldview. And let me correct something, because I should also refer to him as a she.
I wasn't going to say nothing.
No, nobody's never seen God. And hey, God just might be a she. And I have no problems with that.
Okay. All right. Okay. I have so many things I want to chat about. But so you mentioned family when you were talking about your transition. Actually, you didn't say transition. So what was happening while you were in banking? You talked about how that brought you closer to family. And one of the things that I did want to definitely touch upon today was courageous parenting. I just made this up, hashtag courageous parenting. But I really feel like if I look back at how I was raised, I feel like there were certain things that you did that were pretty non-traditional, I will say. I think mainly when I look around me at my peers at that time, I think mainly in giving me a voice and permission to use my voice as far as express my opinions, as far as being in conversation with you and your friends and other adults, of course, respectfully, but like there was that, yes, this is a person, even though she's young, with opinions and ideas. Let's hear them.
Yes.
Let's cultivate this mind.
Yes.
And then also your work with this organization called Isutu, which it still exists. It is not was, right?
As a matter of fact, I went to a reunion this past weekend.
Okay. So it's a rites of passage program for African American boys. You can say more about what that is, but also at the time when you were doing this was extremely non-traditional. And I'm thinking about how I'm raising my son. And for me, this is an act of courage because I don't know what I'm doing for one, but I know what I don't want to do. I just feel like parenting is an act of courage, especially when you go against the grain, like wanting to give my child a voice, wanting to not inundate him with fear of people, fear of police, with fear of using his voice. And he can be a handful. And at the same time, I don't want to parent him into fearing people, into fearing me. I want to get your thoughts. I want to pick your brain on this idea of courageous parenting.
I'll try.
Yeah. What comes up for you when I say this term, and what does that mean for you? Or do you consider yourself a courageous parenting figure, not just to me, but there are a lot of people that look up to you as a parental figure, a father figure. No, really.
Yeah, should have seen the text mails I had to return yesterday.
Oh my God, yes. You only have one daughter, one child. You only have to return one.
I got 50 million other. But no, it's really funny. I guess I never looked at it from that standpoint as being a courageous parenting. But I was always concerned about, I never wanted to over discipline you. And you really were only disciplined for two reasons. One was for disrespect, and the other was for disobedience. That's it, because I recognize you as being God's child, that you were given to me and the family for a reason. And that I was there to encourage you and to help you to develop your own God-given talents and abilities, and not to do anything that would shorten or deaden that cycle of life for you. Because I had no idea at that point, as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, what profession that you would end up being in, etc. But whatever it was, if it was going to be a lawyer, if it was going to be a civil rights leader or whatever, I felt that you needed to have that nurture and that development, and should not be developing fear of using your God-given talent. And I still feel that way, even when I went into the mentoring program that you mentioned, Sutu. Because that's one of the things, that's also an African tradition too, that basically says that the parents, it is up to the parents, because the parents are the closest ones to that child. And it is up to the parents to be observant of that child and to help steer them, and not to reinvent them or recreate them into being you all over again, because you have your own separate reservoir of talents and abilities. And I, as a parent, I'm just supposed to steer as best I can without oversteering, if that makes sense.
Tell us more about Asutu. And there's also, so Asutu is for the boys, but there's also one for the girls. And
Yes.
was it Into Johnny?
Into Johnny, yes.
Okay. So what is a rites of passage slash mentoring program?
Yeah. When we think about a typical rites of passage, especially for a child that grows up from childhood to adulthood, we normally recognize phases that a person goes through. There's always the prenatal, then you got your infancy, then you got your childhood, then you got what we call pubescence, and then into, I would say, boy, I can't remember right now what we call that last phase, but it's really your teen years, right before you reach adulthood. Maybe I should just call it pre-adulthood. And so what the Rites of Passage program does is we, in Asutu, we took young boys at age 6, which according to the cycles of life that, or the passages of life that one goes through, that was with the earliest age that we took in young boys. And we actually brought them in to one group that was age 6 to 10. And of course, there's certain things that you're learning in life during those stages. And then, of course, you go into another stage of the pubescence, which we were saying would be from 10 to 12, actually 11 to 12. Then we moved into the pre-adult stage, which was the 13 to 18. And we tried to help create, develop, instill something within that child during those stages of life. And so that it ends up being a much more meaningful passage, and that you gain as much as you possibly can through that particular passage. Because what we did was you transition, let's say, from the younger group, which we called Defante, and these were our boys 6 to 10. And so you transition into the next group, which was Ga, and that was all the boys around the age of puberty. And there are certain things that you're learning and going through, not only mentally, psychologically, emotionally, but physically too, because your body's and one needs to be cognizant of these changes that one is making. But nevertheless, before one can move from one group or transition from one state to another, there are certain things in life the Africans believe, and this is what our program was based upon, that there are certain things that you should learn, and that there should be some kind of rights. How should I say this? Evidence, the fact that you have completed that stage of life. Okay. And so then when you go through the rites of passage to transition from one group to the next, that says that you have accomplished the things, and we've laid out a lot of things that they should be doing. And so when you make that transition, you are ready then to move to the next step. Just as boys coming out of the last program should be ready to move into manhood because of all the things that we've exposed them to, well, and the parents too, because we very inquisitive with the parents and what was going on in the home, the school, etc. And so we could form trust bonds with the boys so that they trusted us. Because if you don't form that trust bond, then they're not going to talk. They're not really going to communicate with you. Got to be able to get there. And one of the ways that you express courage there, sometimes, especially with our older boys, is when we as mentors open ourselves up to give what's inside to them. Not that we're trying to reshape them, but so we're sharing. I was your age at one time too. You know, we did this, we did that. Sometimes it might not have been so favorable, but hopefully one learned a lesson from that, and it turned into a positive consequence. I got a little bit off track.
No, you didn't. I have a question. Not only, but I have a question. I'm just wondering because if I recall, I know there was like that the Isutu program existed, but I feel like the program that you all did, that you put a lot of extra, you were doing a lot of research and you were adding to this program. And it's Pride Month, and I know that within the trans community, there's a complete void. And I'm wondering if you see a space for this in like an African rites of passage program, because I
Hmm.
think I'm just recalling some young, I guess I don't want to call them youth, but they're in
Hmm.
their early 20s who could really benefit also from something like this. But as it stands right now, everything is so binary. And I'm just wondering, do you think that there would be like an opening for something like that, or?
I do, and I hope that as society grows and as organizations grow that sponsor the rites of passage programs, that there is a greater awareness, a consciousness, okay, so we can get away from this binary situation that you just mentioned, because the fact of the matter is that human beings come in all kinds of shapes and genders, etc. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that there should be something there. As a matter of fact, we in our program did have some same gender loving mentors who were actually part of the program. It was nice that we were included them as well, but I thought that we maybe could have made some changes to our program to get them before. And of course, you're dealing not only with the mentees and the mentors, you're dealing with parents too. Okay.
Okay.
And
Okay.
sometimes, believe it or not, when subjects of this matter came up, our greatest opposition came from parents.
Really?
Okay.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. No, but I'm just imagining that because there have been so many interesting. Oh, there's this guy. Was it Patrice? I think it's Malidoma, and he really talks about the importance of, or not the importance and the role of transgender within traditional African communities. And
Mhm.
so I'm sure that it would fit right in. And like I said,
Yeah. And I really
very
think that it is
necessary.
because I think that the young men, since they're right into this age already, and some of their friends,
Mm,
okay, are trans or bi or same gender loving or whatever, they're living in that world already. And it's just
yeah.
that some of the older folks
Gotcha.
who can't visualize that world because they're
Okay.
so tied to tradition
Mm-hmm.
or
It's coming.
yeah, it's coming.
It's
And you're
coming.
right.
It's coming.
Yes, I agree.
Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. So I have, oh my gosh, what else? I have another question. And this comes from something that I read today. And I read this interesting article. And Juneteenth right now is interesting to me because this whole Juneteenth movement has taken off while I am across the world. So I haven't really been up in there. But I read a really cool article today. It was, what was it, UNC Chapel Hill? Somebody was
Hmm.
reflecting because I guess this is the second year that Juneteenth has been the official
Yes.
and an official holiday.
Yes.
And they were talking about this whole concept of, or imagining what would it be like if everyone celebrated Black liberation. And the interesting thing is, I don't know, I thought it was so interesting because I think when they use language like when everyone celebrates, and up to this point, what I have witnessed from afar in many of these types of celebrations, Black History or if it's MLK Day, is an honoring of Black culture, but not necessarily like a personal celebration of Black liberation. You know what I mean? What does that mean when someone who is not African American is celebrating what Black liberation looks like?
Yeah.
And not necessarily, okay, Black liberation. I saw some really interesting posts of people, like I said, celebrating like Black culture, but that's still kind of, I don't know, it seems like a step outside of oneself.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think of when I say something like that? Is this like far fetched or is it like a weird concept or a weird imagining?
No, no, I don't think so. It's the fact of the matter is that there are so many different races, nationalities, ethnic groups, cultures, etc. And right now, I'm thinking that maybe the emphasis is being placed on the Black culture in particular because it has not really received heretofore any great celebratory reign or recognition, if you will. It was, when we do Kwanzaa, for instance, it was Malana Karinga was established back in the 1960s. And that was a revolutionary thing because, for one, I think it really helps Black people more so than anything else because it's saying you are somebody. and your culture is just as great as someone else's culture is. Because prior to that, of course, it was like, you guys really don't have a culture. You really don't have a distinct past. You really have not made any historical contributions to life, to society, to the world, etc. And so now I think maybe it's coming out. And it would appear that it's being done at the expense of somebody else, but it really is not. In my old age, I'm really getting more sensitive to this thing of intersectionality, where you're learning how to respect others, even though they might not necessarily be the same as you. So it's cool if I'm a white person or if I'm Asian, Native American, whatever, to celebrate Black History Month, okay? Or even this Juneteenth. I saw uh, a spot on a TV program that I was looking at earlier today, even. And it was a woman who actually got Juneteenth to be a legal federal holiday. And she pushed until she actually got there. And her comments that they were interviewing, her comments was, hey, it would be nice if we could blend this Black liberation into white liberation and have a celebration between June 19th through July 4th. And let's blend these fellas together. And I said to myself, wow, that's a unique approach.
Okay.
And quite different. And she said, then we can all celebrate, okay, together, more or less. I don't know. I hope I answered your question.
No, you did. And I guess what I'm thinking is I am interested as to when a celebration of Blackness will not just be on what this assumed Black culture, and when it gets a little deeper, because I think it's great. I'm not saying that I don't like these things, but to me, it feels very separate. A celebration of the kind of music that I like, or like Black heroes, is not necessarily a celebration of myself as a human being that has Black or dark skin. And yeah, so when I hear terms like Black liberation, that's what I think of. I think of like being liberated from all of this and just being celebrated for who I am as a human being, and not for an accomplishment or not for an art form or not for these things. And so, yeah, that's what came to mind when I read this article.
Well, I was looking at it from the standpoint of being recognized, some of the things. Because we look at Juneteenth, Juneteenth was 1865. When the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in January of 1863. So we're talking, what, 2.5 years almost.
Yeah.
Before the folks in Texas even recognize that. And if nothing else, it causes me, it elevates my consciousness, because I'm saying to myself, why did it take so long for word to reach the folks in Texas? And then if one does a little research, which we sometimes don't have accurate historical perspective, you learn that the states that the so-called slaves were being freed were primarily in the Confederacy. Okay. And I don't know if Texas was a part of the Confederacy, but anyway, what was happening was that slaves were being transferred from other states to Texas.
Really? I didn't
during
know
that period. And see, that needs to be talked about. And there's so many things that are compacted in this stuff, and you really don't even recognize what's really truly going on. And if nothing else, I think that it would be nice if the stuff could be studied a little bit, not to elevate one group or another, but so that we can get an accurate historical perspective. And I think that really then helps us to understand why there's a need for recognition, celebration, or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. And I wanted to explain everything the kite. And I'm like, let me get up on it. But I did not see that anywhere. Okay. More digging. We have more digging to do.
It's usually not out there. But no, check it out.
I will check it out. I will.
Yeah, that there were just thousands of slaves brought in from other states and purposely put in Texas.
Really? Huh. This is interesting. Unfortunately interesting. Okay. All right. I want to switch gears one more time. I have one more question for you. And this is courageous businesses. And this term just came to mind. This term just came to mind. And it's a thing now, I think, especially from the pandemic, of people starting their own businesses or having all these different streams of income. Also, what is beautiful now is there are so many people wanting to have this conscious businessing, conscious business practices. And I don't think that this was popular in the 80s when you started your business. But one thing that really stood out to me about your business, my dad had a business, a wholesale business where he was selling audio, video needs, doing duplication and all this sort of thing, and mostly working with churches. But at the core, I feel like you did not have a traditional business model. And at the core, it was very social focused, like employing people or helping people out. And I feel like that there are sacrifices with something like that. What was the driving force behind that decision? Because I think that there was a definite conscious decision on how you wanted to run your business.
For sure. After I left the banking industry, I knew that I wanted to be in a business myself. And I had thought about the kind of business that I would really like to operate. And again, I have to put God first because he was the one that instilled. He was the one that instilled these things in my mind, okay, about what to do. Because a business should be more, I felt, than just me making profits. And then me buying a bigger house, expanding my business. That's all great too. But that business also impacts your customers. And one of the things that I always wanted to do was to be able to provide the best possible services and products to my customers. And as a matter of fact, I used to do shopping for my customers. That's what I used to tell them, because I had to look through a whole bunch of different wholesale organizations and know which product I was going to buy. And I tested them out because I wanted them to have a good product.
Hmm.
But the bigger thing was I always wanted to be able to hire people and to be able to create jobs for folks, because I think that is something that was missing within the African American community. But you know my story too about running into Mr. Ed Gardner. Really, that man, I think God put that man in my path, okay? Because he really opened up my mind's eyes so that I could see a much larger picture of what owning a business was really truly supposed to be, and especially even as my business relating to other Black businesses. And it wasn't so much because I was being prejudiced or whatever and dealing with other Black businesses, but it understood that, hey, this was a struggle and we're all in the same struggle. It's hard to get business, hard to get started. And so if nothing else, patronizing one another as well. But one of
Well,
my
tell
key
us who Mr. Gardner is.
Mr. Gardner was, I believe he started out as a teacher, but he ended up starting a business. It was called the Soft Sheen Products. And he started making hair care products for African Americans. And it turned out to be very successful. And that business really grew. I remember him telling us that he started out mixing his first batch of product in his bathtub. Okay. And how he grew beyond that, and how that business, it just exploded. And he really impressed me when he brought us together, because again, I was at the bank when I met him, and he called all of the big time bankers together, and he gave us this speech about you going downtown and working in the ivory towers, and you got your briefcases and your Wall Street journals, etc. Okay. He says, don't forget, some of you belong in that type of environment, but there are some of you that have the capacity, the capability to do something for your own community. Communities where unemployment is just going through the roof, etc., or where jobs are just not available within that particular geographical area. And I took all those things to heart. And I knew when I came out of banking, I wanted to do business, and I wanted to go into business with his mode of thinking. And he put me there. And especially one of the things that he was actually doing, especially after they had grown, they were the largest, I know, African-American owned company in the United States. And he rarely focused on sales, but they had to be around 100 million a year in sales very easily at their high point. But they would actually create opportunities for other Black businesses. If you could come in and show that you had the professional background and credentials to run a company, they would even give you a startup loan to get you started. Yes. And get you in business so they could buy some products from you. And I wanted to do something on that scale. It ended up, though, in my case, I think probably for me, one of my best accomplishments was hiring people and retaining them and really schooling them, because not only are they there working, they're younger people. Maybe they haven't thought about their own career or where do I want to be 3 years from now, 5 years from now. I remember the young lady that used to work for me. She was a few years out of high school. And I asked her that question. I think she might have been about 22 at that time. Where do you see yourself at 25? And she basically hadn't given it a whole lot of thought. She says, I'll be here working. I said, no, you're not going to be here working.
Okay.
We're just an incubator.
Okay.
And we ended up talking her to going back to school. She ended up finishing and she got her AA 2 years later. No, when she first went back to school, I basically told her that she didn't go back to school, I was going to fire her. And of course, I knew I did. So I lied. But no, she actually went back and she took one course and she went back and she was begrudgingly, of course. But she discovered that she liked it. And I knew that she was smart. And that young lady got a little A out that class. And she came back to me and said, Mr. Rule, can I work part-time next semester so I can go to school full-time? Of course.
Nice.
Okay. Long story short, with her, she is now working, she'll be working on her doctorate in ministry soon. Okay. But she just kept moving on up the ladder. The other is a young man, as he came to me looking for a job. And I guess I was very impressed that he was a 16-year-old looking for a job, because most of his peers would be out trying to play basketball and video games. But hey, he wants to work. I did not have a job for him. I cut my own salary to create a part-time job for him.
Wow.
And he came and he happened to be a young man that did not have a father figure at home. And so I ended up being his surrogate father, more or less, on the job. So not only was I an employer, I was a father figure for him too. And whenever he was having problems in school, I'd make sure that I got some of my friends. If I had something that I didn't know in math or whatever, we made sure that there was somebody there, because he hated math at that time. He was a junior. No, he was a sophomore in high school. Long story short, he overcame whatever that fear was through another friend of mine who helped him. He went on, finished high school, and then went into engineering. Now, that blew me away, because engineering is usually in most places a 5-year program, at least it was at the school that I went to, electrical engineering. And he actually graduated, yes. And that is, to me, that's the way you bring that human element in there, and servicing then a wider community and beyond just profit making.
Okay. Yeah. My last and final question, because I know your birthday's coming up and you will be 3/4 of a century. Wear it proud, wear it well. What advice would you have for the younger generation? What's a few things?
Yeah.
Or even that you would give to yourself?
I think that expanding one's consciousness is so critical. And by that, learning more about history, learning more about whatever, going to museums, whether it be art museums or museum of history and art, etc., but especially the reading and learning about prior history and how you got to be this way, wherever you are in life, and then learning how to connect the past with the present, and then you yourself then connecting the present with the future. And I think that is so important, okay? And to think beyond that. Sometimes it might mean that I need to curtail some of my video games a little bit every now and then and establish, a regular reading program where I can expand that knowledge, because it all comes into play and you truly need it. And especially when you become a better critical thinker, that really helps you in life, not only yourself, but your family and the community in which you live in. Because then you become a much more, capable individual, and you have much more to offer. The other thing was definitely we need some God. We need some spirituality here, because that is so important. You can't do it by yourself. You can't say, no, it doesn't exist. And maybe they should walk with someone who is spiritually connected, that they can learn from, so that they can indeed be transformed themselves. Because life is a series of transformations. But if you don't recognize them, then you'll never really get to that point. And you'll never be able to do the rites of passage. We talked about the transitioning. They call it doing the matrix shift. You shift from one matrix to the next. And if you're not aware of what's going on inside of you and around you, then you won't be able to make that connection.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, thank you, Mr. Rule and Rule Daddy. This has been a beautiful conversation, as I knew it would be. Yeah.
You broke my arm.
Okay,
I still got it in a sling here.
Usually I tell people where my guests can be found online. I know you on Facebook, but you don't be checking it.
I don't.
Listen, if somebody wants to ask my dad a question, you can reach out to me. Reach out to The Courageous Voice on Instagram. And you can pester me. You can pester him through me, because my dad has been threatening to write a book for decades now. So perhaps some more gentle nudges would help. We could get like a poetry book. You got the poems, you got like the devotionals you mentioned. I know you have some advice for community upliftment. So maybe I'll be sharing some information like that in the future, but
I hope so.
Yes.
Yeah, because I know this book has been out there. It's been on my mind for years now, maybe even a decade or two. But I know that it's going to happen. But what happens is I think that the subject matter keeps changing, but it's going to get there.
It's going to get there. It's going to get there. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll see you all next time. And please be sure to rate, subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends. Thank you so much. The Courageous Voice podcast is a collaboration between Connect.Faith and me, Chanda Rule. Music is by Ike Sturm and production by Jess Burchett. Thanks for listening.